The end is in sight. The OTR panel this week takes a look at the last major races and where they are in the polling data, and lots of folks are voting in Michigan. Around the OTR table, Kyle Malin, Jordan Hermany, Lauren Gibbons, and Colin Jackson. Sit in with us as we get that inside out, off the record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Martin Waymeyer, a full-service strategic communications agency, partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and public policy engagement. Learn more at martinwaymeyer.com. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
Thank you very much. The end is in sight.
The end is near.
You can feel it, right? Listen, I want you to pretend you're either in the Harris camp or the Trump camp, and you look at data out of Michigan, which says, so far in the early voting, 55% of the vote female, 44% male. What are you thinking?
I mean, I think right now the numbers benefit the Harris campaign when we were talking, and every Trump rally I've been to or every Vance rally I've been to, they always rally the crowd up. They ask them who all's voted early, to borrow a point from Jordan. This is something I've noticed as well. There's been a very concerted effort to promote different types of voting options, but it feels like the supporters there in the audience are not actually embracing those early or absentee voting options. So for this many people to vote early, it does seem like it benefits Democrats, at least on the face of it.
Yeah, I know in the Novi rally that Trump had very recently, he and others preceding him in trying to fire up the crowd kept pumping up the who here's ready, who here's excited to vote early, make sure you vote early. And you could have heard a pin drop in that arena. There was some muffled cheers, but it's not a good sign. You hear of a
Those were the Democrats that infiltrated the rally.
But you hear of a high female turnout. That's very beneficial with the gender gap, especially with Democrats trying to make abortion such an issue. And sorry, I think I cut you off there for a second.
Oh, yeah, that was the point that I was going to make. We have been seeing in these numbers, there's been more men supporting Trump, more women supporting Harris. So if more women are turning out to vote, that would suggest that perhaps those numbers are good for Harris.
You want to make it unanimous?
No, I'm going to talk more about the squeezing of the balloon. Like, is this just people have decided that they're changing their voting habits? Or is this that there's actually going to be more turnout? I mean, I don't think that you can really read too much into results at this point. I'm more interested in the universe of people who are voting, and are these low propensity voters that both the Republicans and Democrats are going after, are they actually showing up, and will we have more people actually voting in 2020? And I think the answer is going to be yes.
All right, but what about the 55-44 split female?
Whatever. Maybe they just want to vote early. I mean, I'm not reading too much into that, because maybe on election day it'll be 55% men and 45% women. That's what I mean by the squeezing of the balloon. I'm not going to get worked up about that. I'm more interested in the fact that this election has become like this all-consuming thing, and it's just become amazingly exhausting. I mean, I know that I'm getting a little older, but this has been more exhausting than any election that I've had to cover. And it's the rallies, it's the emails, it's the text messages. It just never seems to end.
And for us, it's not going to end either. I mean, both presidential campaigns in the final day, they're going to be right back here in Michigan. Harris here on Sunday, Trump here on Monday. We have a ton of get out the vote stuff that's going on in between then. It's just never ending for a swing state like us.
And I think we have seen just up and down the ticket, everyone is just pouring money into Michigan, nationally, state level. And it's not just the presidential, it's not just the Senate, it's all these competitive congressional races, it's all these competitive state house races, which are on track to be the most spending that we've ever seen in state house races. Those mailers that people are getting to their inbox, like even the Supreme Court, you've seen a decent chunk of change be invested into trying to turn people out to vote. Or if you have taken out an absentee ballot or you're planning to vote early, then there's 15 mailers a day telling you to turn your ballot in or vote early now. So it is aggressive at this point for every voter.
And I do want to touch upon something Kyle said earlier. Maybe the election day turnout's a little bit different, so maybe it might be too soon to look into these early voting numbers. But if you look at speeches that Republican Congressman John James has given at some of these Trump rallies, where he's encouraged, he always uses a Lions metaphor. You don't let the other team run up the score 3/4 of the game, and in the fourth quarter, all of a sudden now try to score the points and wonder what happened the next day. So you got to wonder, what's going to happen on election day? You hope people can vote and you hope people can turn out to the polls, but things always happen. babies get sick, cars get flat tires.
Well, and at this point, too, it's forecasted it's probably going to rain on Election Day, which does not bode well for, I mean, you
Nobody
think...
wants to go out in the rain.
Well, historically, too, I mean, obviously with 2020 being a bit of an outlier because of COVID, traditionally Democrats vote absentee or are more inclined to vote absentee, and Republicans are more inclined to vote day of, and that's not good news for the Trump campaign if that rain persists.
The numbers coming out of Detroit, the prediction that 53% turnout would beat what Biden did in 2020. He got 51%, and there was a major problem in 2016 with Ms. Clinton. She got 49. The numbers out of Detroit, a good vibe for the Ds?
Well, historically, you would say yes. But I would also say that the Trump campaign has done a good job in turning over African-American males into their camp. The numbers just seem to be on the incline on that. So historically, that would be yes, but it could also be a harbinger of what we're going to see across the state as well with people voting early. You know, the whole early voting thing has become a bit of an experiment for us. This is the first big election where we've had this, and we've already saw at least one hiccup in the University of Michigan where we had a Chinese national go in, somehow get a ballot, vote, his vote is counted, and then he came back and they were like, oh, you know what, you shouldn't have voted. Like, how many people are like that out there? And I think once all the hubbub about who wins and loses and so forth is all said and done, the Republicans are going to be bringing this up time and time again and saying, you know, we got some holes in our election system here that because we've made this so accessible, it's become maybe too accessible.
You can see why over the years in this town, Republicans in the legislature have opposed election reforms. Because now the Democrats have been fighting, especially on absentee ballot. I can remember we had every Secretary of State going back to Richard Austin, including Republicans, Candace Miller and Terry Lynn Land, who said we need absentee voting. And all the Republicans in the legislature would always laugh when they showed up in committee and said, no, we're not going to do that. That's going to kill us. This absentee vote becomes a critical part of this election.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, you know, from a clerk perspective, you know, having the absentee ballots, you know, does take off some of the deluge of Election Day. I recall when early voting was being discussed and on the ballot initially, that was where the major concern was for local election officials, because it is just really hard to staff for that many days. It's hard to bring those people in. That said, on Election Day, those votes do get tabulated very quickly. You just press a button. It's already done. You just count them on Election Day. So we have seen that absentee voting is just a hugely popular option ever since that became no reason absentee. I would expect that continues. We'll see that continue. Early voting is kind of that wild card that we still have to see, you know, just how many voters take advantage of that option.
Well, we had 2.4 million on Thursday going into this Friday taping, so it'll be interesting. But it looks like Pennsylvania is going to keep us awake at night.
Yeah, it's something about them needing 4 days to finish tallying all the votes.
Secretary of State said on 60 Minutes.
To that point, I mean, I think you brought it up earlier where, you know, we by and large in 2020 knew, even with Pennsylvania being the last state to count all of their votes, we by and large knew that Biden won the election. So am I at all concerned that it's going to take them that long? No, I'd much rather a state be thorough and accurate than fast and wrong, God forbid, especially with past precedent being what it is. So, you know, it stands to reason, though, that it does open up an avenue for certain people to say, well, why is it taking so long? Well, why? And further misinformation or distrust in the election system could be sown.
The slower it goes, the antsier people get. We saw that in Michigan in 2020 in a big way. It's like, why is this not getting counted faster? You can say every reason you want. People want to see results quickly.
Well, the Trump campaign has laid the foundation, and it is firm. It's not asphalt. It is cement, that they've got a vehicle to go into Pennsylvania and question the outcome of the election.
Yeah, and then we also got to look in our own state, the city of Warren, where the clerk in Warren has said, we're not going to take advantage of the law that allows us to pre-process our absentee ballots. And, you know, as you've been reading off the stats, and what I'm thinking is, all right, how long will it take to count? Well, in Pennsylvania, they said it's going to take 4 days. Whereas the clerk in Warren says, oh, we can pound it out in the night. You know, everything's fine. We've got a well-oiled machine here. Well, which is it? You know, is Warren got it figured out and the state of Pennsylvania has not? So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that.
What are the chances of a disturbance either during the election or after the election? What do the tea leaves point to?
I mean, I'm always an optimist, so I really want to hope that.
Anybody else? I appreciate optimism.
Yeah. I mean, a disturbance after the election. I mean, we'll always wonder, on election night, even if the race does get called, unless it's very, very close, I can imagine, we're all going to see these rumblings. We've seen that messaging coming, especially from the Trump campaign, about falsely claiming, Democrats want to cheat and everything else. We've seen that rhetoric. That's nothing new, and whatever comes of that, remains to be seen. What gives me a little bit of optimism is I have seen, some of these pushes, especially within conservative circles, to try to train people about the process so you don't see repeats of what happened in 2020 where people are causing disturbances while trying to watch absentee ballots and end up being removed from the center or something like that. So I think that hopefully, at least with people understanding the process a little bit more, even if they don't like it, that we'll see a few less disturbances, and that will hopefully cut down on some, at least this immediate chaos.
There is a publication called Site, which monitors the chatter. And the woman that runs that, speaking for herself, not for the organization, said the chatter is louder and it's more organized, and she would not be surprised if there were problems to try to intimidate immigrants who are trying to vote during the election and stuff afterwards. What are you all hearing?
Well, I haven't heard that. I mean, that's interesting. But to Colin's point, though, I am concerned about people thinking they're election experts because they stayed in a Holiday Inn Express. Everybody thinks they know everything these days because they got a Twitter account and they can pop off on social media. But do you really know how an election works? Do you actually know how hard it is to cheat? Do you know how hard it is to go in?
It doesn't matter that the cheating doesn't.
It doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter because everyone's an expert, and so they can get these numbers and they can say anything they want and get excited. And we saw that in 2020. And we're 4 years removed, and I'm glad Colin's an optimist. I'm not an optimist. I think we've just got more people who think they know what they're talking about. We've even got a state rep who's saying, hey, there's more people who have voted than, people who are
on the rolls.
It's unbelievable. Okay, well, do something about it if you're a state rep and you're so passionate about it. But I mean, so this is just an example. I mean, this is somebody who's an official who's saying that. I think it's just going to get worse.
I mean, yeah, the idea that everybody nowadays has the ability to say that they're elections experts because they did a little bit of training, whether that's going to be a good or a bad thing at the end of the day, I have no idea. We've seen, like you just pointed out, people getting on their pulpits and saying that they know X and Y and Z about the election system, despite the fact that they just started looking into elections probably within like the last 4 years. At the same time, I am hoping, though, that efforts to try and educate broader swaths of not just Michiganders, but Americans. When we were talking about the TCF, the ballot dump that occurred late night, well, we being in the election sphere, that was not surprising to us. Of course, absentee ballots are going to continue to come in throughout the night. That was not any cause for alarm for us, nor was, the photos that you'd see of wagons, which turned out to be a TV crew hauling in their cameras. So, we now know we're more educated, I would argue, as a country about, or I would hope we're more educated as a country about sort of the general election processes, that things won't be as picked apart as they were in 2020, or that the ability to cast doubt is a little harder. I'm also not going to get ahead of my skis with that, though.
I think one interesting point to note as well, our election system is not the same as it was in 2020. There were additional pieces of legislation passed that were intended to respond to some of these concerns. Now, whether this will be a stopgap, that remains to be seen. But Democrats in particular were really trying to make it so there wasn't this tempest this option for people, especially with the reforms to the Board of Canvassers and election certification, and even adding in some additional election securities around drop boxes or those kinds of things. So it hasn't remained stagnant, which is also interesting. That said, we're still, the litigation from the results of the 2020 election and the response to it is still ongoing as voters are casting their ballots for an election 4 years later. So it's not over by any means.
What happened in the UP?
Well, up there we had a clerk in Rock River Township. I keep messing around with the words, but
River Township.
But so he and his deputy clerk had announced that had indicated to the Secretary of State that they had plans to hand count their ballots. Prior to a county canvass, the Secretary of State vis-a-vis Elections Director Jonathan Brader said, you can't do that. That's against state election law. We have processes laid out. And because of that, they were removed from their roles and they were replaced by other area clerks and I believe a township treasurer. So to that point, I've already seen people question, oh, well, is this election interference? And any move, left, right, center, regardless, is going to be hyper scrutinized these coming days because everybody constantly feels like the other side, quote unquote, is out to get them. But in this case, this was just general election law needing to be followed. And nobody besides the clerk and the deputy clerk had come to this conclusion that a hand count was needed. So in the end, they were ultimately removed.
There's an old saying, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind is made up.
Well, on that point, though, it feels like, and what Lauren said earlier about Michigan's election law is changing, it seems like the election misinformation at this point has been brought up in election integrity, or not election integrity circles, but the circles trying to fight this election disinformation, where it feels like there's been asymmetrical warfare going on almost, where the conspiracy theories have been allowed to run rampant, and then people that were just running elections, the election administrators and everything, they're kind of caught flat-footed. So yes, we've seen, these past 4 years, the conspiracy theorists, election deniers, et cetera, they've had more time to organize and make themselves feel like experts. But at the same time, we've seen election officials and clerks and the people that run these things also have more time to try to fight misinformation and be more geared up and be more prepared for some of this backlash.
When you were talking about people's minds made up, it made me think of this polling that we just did with Mitchell. 72% of the people we polled said that their mind had been made up long ago, that this decision was very easy for them, and only 20% said they actually had to give it some thought and looked at both sides before casting their ballot. People's minds were made up a long, long time ago on this.
Bernie Porn in his survey found that we have no undecided voters left in Michigan.
Mitchell said 1%.
All right. Well, who's going to argue over 1%? Okay.
But 0 to 1% in the margin of error.
His point is this: he thinks that the Kennedy factor, and Mr. Kennedy got 5% of the poll, could determine the winner in Michigan. Interesting angle on the story. Any takers on that one?
Yes, I think they could. People who are going to vote for Robert F. Kennedy anyway.
Well, or are confused. Okay, his name is on the ballot, and even though he said, I'm not a candidate, how many people heard that on the evening news?
Well, and why do you think that he tried to push so hard to fight to get his name removed once he dropped out of the race and threw his support behind Trump? I think they're well aware of the fact that the longer his name, or at this point, his name's not getting off the ballot. There is no way.
Right.
There's already
even the
2
Supreme
point
said,
something. Yeah, right. Yeah. 2 point something million people have already voted. He's not getting off the ballot. And yeah, that should be a cause of concern for the Trump campaign in a state where, like you said, 5% of the voters earlier.
Even if it's not 5, if it's 3% in a close race, that is the deciding factor.
That could balance out with Jill Stein, though.
Yes,
I mean, to be
she's
fair,
about 1 or 2, so the D's are not home free either.
They could cross each other out. I mean, we do got a libertarian who hasn't run in as strong of a campaign as in the past either. So I don't know if that third party will make a difference.
I think it will.
To the point about undecided voters, though, at this point, what's left to decide? The candidates have been in Michigan. They're basically living here. They were very familiar with most of their policies. They've debated. They are sending mailers left and right. There's very little left to decide. At this point, it's who decides to come out and vote.
Well, that's the point. And some of those folks simply will say, forget it. I'm not going to vote.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, okay.
U.S. Senate race.
Yes, the U.S. Senate race. I mean, right now you're seeing both sides project confidence. You're hearing from the Rogers campaign that their internal polling has them up. You're hearing from the Slotkin campaign that they also feel confident in this race. I've seen the ads recently, where Slotkin's making her quote-unquote, or not quote-unquote, but to paraphrase, her final argument in this race. It seems like both campaigns really are trying to push their own, to rephrase it, I guess it's a very cliche to say, you know, both campaigns are pushing their own vision for the future, right? I've been seeing a lot of Rogers ads where he's pushing culture war issues, you know, think transgender athletes in sports, you know, even though that's a relatively small part of the percentage. Meanwhile, Slotkin, she's kind of relying on the same message she's used throughout her whole career, trying to message to the middle, talking about playing up her national security record or trying to help her mom with health care in the final days of her mom's life, et cetera.
She came back to that spot at the end. Isn't that interesting?
It's been interesting watching sort of the evolution of their advertising, especially because, you know, back a couple months ago even, a couple weeks ago even, you'd see Rogers constantly trying to hit Slotkin on EVs, on China, on the fact that, oh, she's a farmer, but, you know, is she really? And then now recently coming back home to this culture war issue of transgender athletes, to me, that seems like a candidate who's nervous. Past precedent in Michigan suggests that those culture war niche issues are not well accepted by the broader electorate. I mean, we saw in 22 gubernatorial candidate Tudor Dixon try and run on that, protecting girls' sports, and she lost by double digits. Percentage points.
The people that are going to vote on that are already in the fold.
And that's the thing. So who is this message speaking to? Because it's turning off your more centrist voters who might say, why does this affect me at all? I don't care about this.
This is the U.S. Senate, boys and girls, right?
And I was just going to say, this is my last point, too. I mean, the polling that the Rogers campaign has touted where they're out ahead, this is also the only poll I believe I've seen in recent weeks, at least, that has put him ahead, and usually Slotkin is coming out on top, so even a little more of a concern.
That was our poll. You know what?
2 points.
2 points.
Margin of error.
Yeah, margin of error. Still within the margin of error. But you know what I found more interesting than Rogers up 2 is that he's tracking with Trump. For the first time, this is a poll that showed him tracking with Donald Trump, because in prior polls, he was running 3 to 5 percentage points back. Now, Mitchell did the first sample on a Monday, did 500 results. And he looked at that and he's like, Rogers is tracking with Trump finally? And he was so concerned about it, he did it again.
Yeah.
He did another 500 and it showed that. So I think that's the more interesting thing, that maybe Trump and Rogers' fortunes are more aligned than we thought.
Well, I had an original thought, I think, the other night. If Mr. Rogers had not hooked his wagon to Mr. Trump, would this race be closer?
I don't think he would have made it through the primary.
Yeah. I think that's the bigger thing. He had to get over that hurdle. There is a huge sect of the Republican Party where, and if you remember too, Trump even a couple years ago was bashing Rogers for being a rhino, for not sticking up for him. And now he needs his support because Trump is effectively a kingmaker in the Republican Party.
I mean, hypothetically, maybe it would have been closer, but he needed to do that. He needed to do that to get the base Republican support. And fundamentally, I do think this race ultimately comes down to how the top candidates play. It's a statewide race. You know, while we have seen some polling that suggests Slotkin has pulled a little higher than the presidency, I ultimately think, you know, who wins Michigan will very likely determine the Senate race as well.
We've gotten pretty tribalized, too. I mean, tribalized as a country. And so it's hard to separate yourself as a Republican from Donald Trump, and likewise.
Yeah, but you know, all right. See, he took the Trump endorsement. What if he started to walk that back, as we thought? That's an option to get into the general election. You know, Rogers had, when he was in the legislature, this guy was not a bomb thrower. He knew how to work with other sides and kind of congenial. You wouldn't call him a super moderate, but he certainly wasn't a far right moderate. Maybe the original thought, I just shouldn't have had it.
But I guess, like, at this point, just separating yourself from Trump at this point, with Trump having this much popularity within what's left of the Republican Party, I think it's hard to do that sprint to the center that you've seen traditionally in past elections.
All right, House elections down the road. How does it look?
House?
State House.
I think, you know, I started believing at the very beginning when Biden was the presumptive nominee that the Republicans would take majority. Then Harris came in, injected some new enthusiasm. I walked that back. But now I'm more in line to think that Republicans will probably take majority.
The juice wasn't there on Ms. Harris?
I think Kamala Harris's momentum didn't crest over 50% for a long period of time. And you got to remember that the seats that the Democrats won in 2022 was because abortion was on the ballot and Gretchen Whitmer blew out Tudor Dixon by 10 points. And both of those factors aren't in this one.
But if you talk to Rick Snyder, he is just madder than a wet hen. No, he doesn't get mad. I scratched that. He doesn't, okay? I'm sorry, Governor. He was concerned that the Democrats are still playing the abortion issue in local House races, and his argument is this issue has been settled. But, Governor, with all due respect, the Democrats say, no, it's not been settled.
Right, and that has been a huge theme, constantly hammering Republican candidates on abortion in all of these competitive races.
They wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't working.
Yes, certainly. It's still such an issue of concern at the national level. So even though, you know, the argument has been from the conservative side that it's been decided in Michigan that the
People voted.
The people voted, the people have decided, but the Democrats make a compelling case that, you know, if the pendulum were to swing the other way, that Republicans who have long said that they were anti-abortion would probably look to restrict some of those rights. And I think you're still hearing that from a lot of Democrats in terms of, you know, who it's all such a toss-up, right? But it comes back, I keep looking back to those numbers in 2022. When Whitmer was ahead by that much, it was still that close. And if you know, Trump does well in a lot of these areas like Downriver, Macomb, that could be the death knell.
Which way does the House go?
I am going to be so honest. At this point, it is a toss-up for me. I want to say that, especially with the fundraising that Democrats have been doing, God knows that I have seen ad after ad after ad after ad for every candidate, including those who I'm not even in their district. So they've definitely got the momentum there. My big question is, as they continue to push the abortion as an issue, whether or not that's just kind of getting lost in all of the noise. You know, you're constantly hearing it. Democrats are doing a heck of a job in making sure that that's their standard message, but are people actually receiving it when Republicans are pushing so hard on the fact it's been decided?
I would say that Republicans are spending a lot of time in the districts where these people are. Meanwhile, Democrats have a lot of seats to defend, not a lot they're trying to flip. I think Republicans have the advantage.
Should we erase this tape?
Only if we're wrong.
Only if we're wrong. I like that. You ought to go into TV news. Thank you all very much. Good program. If you haven't voted, why don't you get in the game? Everybody else has already done it. Next week, a recap of what y'all did. Should be interesting. See you then.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Martin Waymeyer, a full-service strategic communications agency, partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and public policy engagement. Learn more at martinwaymeyer.com. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan Public Television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record.